Okay. We're on to our next subject, which is about the age of Jackson. Um, Andrew Jackson is certainly a very divisive president. I'll lay my cards on the table. I'm not a big fan of Andrew Jackson, but he's a very interesting president and he's a very transformative president. There certainly is no doubt that Jackson changed the presidency, changed America. And liberals and conservatives have been fighting with him ever since. And even during his presidency, the Whig Party was formed, which was basically the liberal party of its day, and was formed in protest. Remember that there was no two-party system after the War of 1812. After about 1815, the Federalist Party collapsed. The Republican Party was ascendant. Everyone in America was just different factions of the same party. This is known as the era of good feelings. Well, basically, all the good feelings come to an end when Andrew Jackson becomes the president. This is a very famous portrait. If you don't know where you've seen this before, this is on the $20 bill. This is a portrait of Andrew Jackson right after he won the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. So this is actually a younger Andrew Jackson in his mid to late 40s. When he was president, he actually looked... Oh, and I realized I'm not sharing my screen. Sorry. Well, that didn't come off as well as I thought. It's okay. Here we go. So this is, the portrait of Andrew Jackson with the 20. As I'm sure most of you know, you've seen a $20 bill before. This is actually a photograph of him a little after he was president. He leaves office in 1837. This picture was taken in 1845. Photography was just coming out. In fact, it wasn't even called photography. They were called daguerreotypes because it was a Frenchman named Daguerre who invented this device that could capture an image. And so this is really how he looked. I think we've all seen this guy, right? He yells at you to get off his lawn, and he's old, and his heart medication flames up his temper sometimes. So this is just to show you that sometimes you got your myth and then you got your reality here, right? It's a painting, right? If I was going to have a painting commission and there was no photography, I would tell the artist to take a few liberties to make me look more heroic than I actually did. So when we ended last time, we were still with Monroe. Monroe wins overwhelmingly in 1816 because the Federalist Party basically committed suicide by coming out so strongly against the War of 1812. Vote against it if you want, but just out and out working with the enemy, which is essentially what they did in New England, that just embarrassed them beyond belief. Nobody wanted to call themselves a Federalist after that. Hamilton had died in that famous duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. They had great leaders, but those men were all ashamed of how their comrades behaved. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, they weren't part of all this, coddling of the British during the war, but many were. In fact, most were. And so Monroe sails to a very easy re-election in 1820. He ran nearly unopposed. Rufus King of Massachusetts does run against him, but gets stomped. It's embarrassing. We just don't have elections like that anymore. And I forget what the tally was, but it's, triple digits to single digits, basically, like 322 to 4, something like that. So it seemed like there was going to be no two-party system, that we would just operate like this. Well, in 1824, Monroe steps down, and then you start to see kind of a breaking down of that two-party system again. You have a multi-way race here. Really, it's a three-way race between Henry Clay of Kentucky, John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, and Andrew Jackson. Sort of springboarded himself into superstardom with his victory over the Battle of New Orleans. He then fought the Seminoles in Florida and made a big name for himself there. And the election kind of breaks down this national unifying party. Now, because the vote is split three ways, nobody gets the majority. Andrew Jackson has the most votes, most meaning a plurality. He doesn't crack the 50% or 51% necessary in the Electoral College, but he does have more than Clay or Adams. But the Constitution says when there's no majority going to any candidate, the House of Representatives decides. Jackson was not a man of national politics, really. He spent time in local politics in Tennessee. He knew the Army. And Clay and Adams outmaneuvered him there. They knew how the Constitution works, so they went and they formed all kinds of coalitions. And basically, Henry Clay realized, I came in third. There's no way that I'm going to win, so I'll tell my supporters to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. We'll have more than Andrew Jackson. And then Adams, when you're the president, you can nominate me, Henry Clay, to be my Secretary of State. And that's this sort of political scheme that they cook up, because they really agreed on most stuff. You know, Clay and Adams both were old Federalists. They believed in a national bank, internal improvements, a tariff, all the things Hamilton wanted. And so they basically merged their parties into one, unified their opposition to Jackson, and won. And Andrew Jackson is sitting on the sidelines sort of saying to himself, wait a minute, I came in first and I lost. Yeah. You know, talk to Hillary Clinton about that. The Constitution is very old and very strange in presidential races. It's not a nationwide popular vote election. And this is the first election ever in America where there was a popular vote for president. Remember that before this, the Electoral College it's not well understood. Basically, the Constitution says each state is granted a certain amount of points. What it is your representatives plus your senators. So your representatives plus 2. Your state possesses that number of votes for the presidential election, and the state determines how they're awarded. You could award it on a nationwide or on a statewide popular vote, and whoever wins that gets all of them. That's how most states do it today. You could do a coin flip. You could do, you know, some kind of silly contest or something. And most states just let bigwig, powerful people in the state legislature decide this kind of stuff. And starting in the 1820s, democracy used to be a bad word, which is weird because everything we say today, oh, that was very democratic. We use it in a positive sense. The founding fathers did not. They always used the word democracy as a pejorative, as an insult. It was synonymous with mob rule or anarchy, which is weird to us today. Jackson was really the first person in America that said, no, democracy, democratic is a good idea. He changed the name of the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, which it has been ever since. So it seems kind of weird, but the Democratic Party of Joe Biden and Barack Obama today was founded by Thomas Jefferson in 1798, which is kind of strange. The Republican Party of today really gets started in 1854 with the Party of Lincoln, and we'll talk about that. But you know, their lineage went back to the Whigs and the Federalists even before that. So Jackson is enraged by this. He's absolutely enraged. He feels that the presidency has been stolen from him. And in fact, he was a scary guy. He had actually killed men, and I don't just mean in battle, which he had done, probably killed dozens of men in battle. But he had also shot and killed several men in duels. He had been in, I think, 4 or 5 duels in his life. This is the way that gentlemen solved their differences out west, where there was no police or constable or courts. If you had a dispute with your neighbor, you would essentially demand satisfaction. I'm sure you guys have seen it in movies, right? You take your gloves off, you slap the other guy in the face, and you say, I challenge you to a duel. And it doesn't work like you guys think in movies, you know, in the Old West when you would do quick draw and whoever drew first. It was really crazy. You would have a coin flip and whoever won the flip would get to shoot first. And so they would say, oh, you've won the toss. All right, you stand still over there. You draw your pistol and shoot. Because musket pistols were so inaccurate back then, you might exchange fire 3 or 4 times and nobody hits anything. Firearms were not as deadly or accurate as they were back then. And honestly, most duels ended when both men got out there, someone would win the coin flip, and then they would just fire their pistol into the air to show, I'm a gentleman, I'm not actually gonna kill you, now you fire your pistol. We were men, we came out here and risked our lives, now let's just shake hands and the end with it. And that's the way most gentlemen were supposed to solve it. Jackson had been shot a couple of times. He got shot in the chest, he got shot in the arm, the bullets were lodged in his body forever. He did not die of infection. The old man was so nasty and foul that no disease could live inside him, I suppose. So I'll tell you a little of his biography. Jackson is born in South Carolina, we think. Much like Hamilton, he was ridiculed his whole life for being an immigrant, which the records show that's not quite true. If we believe the records, which are kind of spotty at the time, Jackson had documentation showing that he was born in South Carolina in 1767, at the tail end of the colonial period. And his parents were Scots-Irish Presbyterians from Northern Ireland, and they immigrated to South Carolina in 1767. His mother pregnant on the journey and gave birth to Andrew just a few months after she got here. Okay, we'll take that at face value. But the rest of his life, everybody said he wasn't really born here. He was an immigrant. Probably not true. He was probably born here, but barely born here. In 1780, at the tender age of 13, he joined the South Carolina militia to go fight against the British. He was captured. And what the British did back then is they would take their prisoners of war because they didn't have, huge prisons on land-based bases. What they did is they would take everyone to the sea, basically. They'd put you on a big prison barge that would be floating, dropped anchor a mile offshore, and then they would interrogate or torture prisoners there. So at 13, Jackson was tortured as a prisoner of war. They used thumb screws on him, which is where it is what it sounds. They take your thumbs and they drive a screw through it into a wooden plank on both thumbs, and then they put like heavy items like tea kettles and stuff like that on it, and they make you stand and like hold that on your thumbs. Real nice people, the British, by the way. So I'd like you to imagine that you're 13 years old and you were captured and tortured for months on end, and how that would shape you into an adult. You'd be probably a pretty damaged individual, right? I mean, living through the times we are now, we're saying it's incredible stress, et cetera, but it's not quite like being tortured with thumb screws. So he was a rather salty individual the rest of his life. He had vowed vengeance on the British, which he would get. As a young man, he developed, skills like intelligence and ambition. He rose through the ranks. He moves out west to Tennessee. He gets involved in the military first, where he's able to use that as a stepping stone to a further career. Finally, in the War of 1812, he gets his chance, distinguishes himself at the Battle of New Orleans, and then he's just launched into stardom, essentially. He was the greatest war hero since George Washington. Everybody toasted Andrew Jackson in 1815. Excuse me. So, prior to that, when he was a young man, before the War of 1812, when he was in his 20s, he had taken his life savings, which he, saved up quite a bit, gave it to some British bankers, and they lost it. They invested in certain commodity futures, and they lost everything. And ever since then, Jackson just said, I don't trust bankers. I don't trust paper money. I think we should use only specie, which is gold and silver coins. We shouldn't use paper money. And I really don't think there should be a national bank. Government should not control the banks. Banks are terrible. And he had a real chip on his shoulder about that the rest of his life. He gets cheated out of the 1824 election. He comes back in 1828. Now, he wanted to duel Henry Clay for, quote, cheating him out of the election. But really, they didn't cheat. They just knew politics better than him. But he wins convincingly in 1828. He wins the popular vote. He wins the electoral vote, and he becomes the president. And he's going to transform the presidency, and he's going to have a huge chip on his shoulder and try to make everybody pay for what they did to him. He wanted to duel Henry Clay in 1824. His, friends and everything, entourage, told him, no, you're running for president. You can't be going around shooting people anymore. That's what ruined Aaron Burr's career. And so they talk him off the ledge. He waits 4 years, and he finally gets elected. During that election of 1828, which was one of the nastiest in American history, lots of opposition research was done. And what they found out was that Andrew Jackson had several skeletons in his closet. Now, a lot of it didn't stick. Like, Adams thought it was really funny that Jackson couldn't spell. They found a lot of letters that he had written to various people and published them in the newspapers. And Jackson was literate, but he had never really gone to college. He just sort of was a self-taught individual, and he couldn't spell hardly anything. And Adams, of course, who went to Harvard and was the son of a president, thought it was hilarious that this man was running for president and was so uncouth that he didn't even know how to spell. That's crazy. Guess what? Americans don't care. Americans don't care, especially when it's the popular vote, Most Americans can't spell, right? That's why we have autocorrect. So, didn't work, but what they did find was that Jackson scandalously, was actually married to 2 different women at the same time. Or sorry, he wasn't, his wife was. Excuse me, I got the story a little mixed up there. Jackson's wife, Rachel, the love of his life, she was married when they met in South Carolina, and he proposed. She decided to leave her husband, but never really filed for divorce, and they ran away together to Tennessee. Divorce laws were way different back then. What's amazing is as late as the 1950s, in the 1950s in America, it was almost impossible to get a divorce. Like you had to prove grounds. Like you couldn't just say, like the reason most people get divorced today is they say irreconcilable differences. Like we just don't get along and we can't get along. And that's acceptable in most courts of law. You just say, all right, that's fine. This is known as no-fault divorce. Divorce laws in the 1950s and before, you had to prove grounds. Like you had to prove that somebody cheated on somebody else, right? You had to actually have the mistress come into court and testify and say, yes, I had an affair with the groom, etc. Or some other thing. You had to prove abuse and you had to have doctors come in and prove all that stuff. So it was darn near impossible. So Rachel just left her husband, moved to another state. Not legal, but she did it. And they lived that way for years, where technically she was married to her first husband, but just lived with Andrew Jackson. They had a ceremony under Tennessee law. They were married as well, but she was technically a bigamist. And this is what Henry Clay drug up when he, hired all these private investigators. And it was hugely embarrassing to Andrew Jackson. And coincidentally or not coincidentally, just after this story was published, Rachel Jackson died of a fatal heart attack. And Jackson blamed Henry Clay for killing his wife by spreading these vicious rumors about her. They were actually true, but maybe they shouldn't have published them. And Jackson comes to the presidency in 1829, effectively saying, I hate the opposition. They murdered my wife, and now I have all the power in the world. So things are going to get a little bit ugly. But before we get there, we'll just talk about the non-political developments in America. For instance, America was the country on the rise in the 1820s. It was phenomenal. It's kind of like when you look at China today and you say, oh my God, China's got 10%, 11% growth every year. It's unbelievable. They have this huge population, very low debt, and they're growing the fastest. We weren't the richest, most powerful country, but we were the one rapidly advancing. In geography, we had expanded way westward, all the way to the Rocky Mountains by this time. So we were larger than any country in Europe, except for Russia. More miles of navigable river. Our economy was growing faster than anybody else's at this time. And our population was growing, mostly through immigration, but also the highest birth rates in the world. We also had the widest spread franchise, which means the right to vote, meaning more people could vote in America than anywhere else per capita, despite all of our awful problems, despite the fact that about 1/5 of all Americans were enslaved. And if you just take the South, that goes up to about 40% nearly of the population of the South was enslaved and couldn't read. Basically, about 80% of slaves were not taught to read because it was felt they could pass messages and plan escapes and sabotage and such. Yet still, America had the highest literacy rates in the world. If you just took New England or the North, literacy rates were higher, far higher than anybody else in the world. It was just astonishing. Public education comes about in the 1830s. Boston is the first to have public school system. So nearly everyone could read and write who was free. And so print proliferated. Now there's steam-powered printing presses where you have a steam engine in a printing shop, which rapidly pushes a piston to make a newspaper. So newspaper print and book print skyrocket during this time period, meaning that prices crash. And virtually everyone now has a home library at this time. It seems rather primitive to us today. So few of us actually buy paper books anymore. We buy Audible or we buy, e-readers, stuff like that. But at the time, this was the height of technology and it liberated people. We were the best read people in the world. And for a democracy, you need a well-read population. You need people that are actually reading politics in newspapers. And we were that cafe society where for fun, men, because women couldn't vote at the time, men would go out to taverns and drink, certainly, but also talk about politics, get the newspaper out and argue and debate. And so this was very unique. A Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville, you see Tocqueville's name here, he was a very young man in his 20s, and he was a student of the French Revolution. He wasn't born at that time, but he studied it, and he wanted to know, why did the revolution work in America, but it failed in France? And so he comes to America, visits every state, studies the prison system, the election system, the education system, the slavery system, everything. And he comes to the conclusion, basically, that the ingredients are just right in America for a democracy, and it's just not there in France. And it's rather amazing. Democracy in America, it's about a 1,000-page love letter to America, which is really interesting. European liberals used to look up to America as like the one free republic in the world, and that's what we want to be. We don't want to have monarchies where people are just locked up arbitrarily. Again, evaluators would kind of ignore or dismiss slavery or minimize it to a certain extent. This is a huge flaw of our system, yet greater percentage could vote. We were moving in the direction of expanding the right to vote to more and more people. More people were reading, and the seeds were kind of planted for that development, for a more democratic society. Voter turnout was high. It was pretty incredible. Now, the South is the big exception to this. There is the same spirit, but it's only amongst free white men. What happened in the South was a rather interesting development after the Revolution. Remember that, strangely enough, Southerners had this weird sort of bipolar or schizophrenic attitude to slavery, meaning if you look at the writings of Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, some of the times they are criticizing slavery, saying it's an awful system. It's not a system that's fit to a free republic. We should not have it. The British gave us this system during the colonial period and saddled us with this huge problem. We want to move beyond it, but we just don't know how. If we just willy-nilly said, all right, we're going to get rid of slavery, the economy would crash, slaves would rebel, what do we do? But they were criticizing it. They were talking about it. They were men who actually said, we realize the hypocrisy. We are hypocrites. We're not going to free our own slaves because we don't really know what the results of that will be, but the system is terrible and it has to be changed. Most of them believed that slavery would die out in about 25 to 35 years. Most of them imagined that by 1808, when the Atlantic slave trade could be abolished, probably most Southerners would even abolish slavery at that time. We just need time to figure out how to do it. They had these weird experimentation sessions where men like Monroe and Madison, just in their home parlor over drinks, said, hey, why don't we provide a program where the government will tax people, create this big fund. We'll have donations to that fund as well to build up a huge fund. We will purchase the freedom of every slave in America, and we will offer them a one-way ticket out of the country back to Africa. And so this scheme did not really work in the long run, but they actually purchased a piece of land in Africa. They named it Liberia, which is still a country today. Its capital would be called Monrovia after Monroe. And they started doing this in very small numbers, just in the hundreds and in the small thousands. They did this for, 20 or 30 years. This is known as the American Colonization Society. Now, today we would look back and say, what an ugly, awful system. Yes, here's your freedom, but you got to leave the country, was basically the message. But you do have to give some credit to men who were slave owners who were actually trying to brainstorm and think of a solution to this problem. This will change after about the 1830s. Southerners will say, no, slavery is not evil, it's good. They used to say it's a necessary evil. That's what Jefferson said. He said, we have a wolf by the ear, meaning that you're in a tough situation, if that's the case, and you don't want to hold on. You want to let the wolf go and run away to safety, but you don't dare just let the wolf go, because as long as you got it by the ear, it can't bite you. So Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Washington, they all felt this way. They all said, yeah, this is an evil, awful system. Washington wrote in his diary when he returned from the Revolution, stunned to find out that productivity had collapsed by 75%. And he said, I don't blame slaves. Why would they work hard when their master is gone? They don't reap any benefits. The harder they work, the poorer they get, because they don't get any benefit. And he just said, men will, black, white, it doesn't matter. Men will not work hard to produce things if they don't get the benefit. This is a system that's doomed. It is going to die soon. The price of slaves, the price of cotton, the price of tobacco went down, down, down all through the 1780s and 1790s. And most men in the South said, well, that's the end of it. Once the price of tobacco and cotton drop below a certain point, we will not be making enough money to feed, house, and clothe our own slaves, and we'll have to end the system and turn them all into tenants and sharecroppers. And they were preparing in the 1790s to do that in Virginia and several other states. And it wasn't to be. The worst thing that happened to slavery in America was the cotton boom of the 1820s and 30s. Two or three things started to happen simultaneously that gave slavery a new lease on life. The first was the cotton gin was invented. Eli Whitney invented this invention. And what the big problem was with cotton production, the planting was fine. The picking of cotton was fine. It was the removing the seeds. It took forever. That was the most labor-intensive part of it. Most slaves sat at a table all day long, picking seeds out of cotton one at a time. And that's what they did. And it took hours. It took like an hour to do 1 pound of cotton. Then this invention was made, and you could put cotton in the top. It looked like a big meat grinder where you'd put it in the top, you'd crank the handle, and these metal teeth would just rip out the seeds. The finished cotton would go through. You'd take it, and you'd just bale it up. So what took an hour before now takes a few seconds. Productivity skyrocketed. So now Southerners said, I can now produce more cotton per hour. I can buy more slaves. I can buy more land, and I can produce more cotton. And so this cycle would repeat itself over and over and over and over again. Excuse me. Sorry. So, where was I? Sorry about that. Oh, yeah, about the expansion of slavery. So you had now the cotton gin. Number two, you had land. Land in the Southwest was very dangerous to go to prior to the War of 1812 because it was home to many native tribes there who would defend their land if encroached upon. After the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson defeated and got every tribe in the Southwest to cede or give up their land. So now it was just open development. Southern families poured in. The soil was exhausted on the East Coast, east of the Appalachians, because they had planted tobacco and cotton there for 150 years, even longer than that, about 200 years by this point. And so now people moved into the most fertile land in the world for cotton cultivation, into what's known as the Black Belt. Southern Tennessee, and then northern Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. That region right there is where huge numbers of slaves were brought. Now, by the 1820s, the Atlantic slave trade was shut off, but slaves had a high birth rate and a relatively low death rate in America. They had a natural increase in population. Slave markets were a huge endeavor, and slaves were brought west in a huge migration in the US. And then these new states west of the Appalachians that I just mentioned, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, eventually Arkansas and Texas. Slavery will take root there because cotton takes root there. And cotton blew up in a huge way. Not only that, but there were huge slave revolts. There was first Gabriel Prosser's revolt in 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, and Nat Turner in 1831. So rather than behave logically here and say, you know, this is indicative of how dangerous slavery is as a system, they dug their fingernails even more into it. They said, this proves that we can't free our slaves because once they're free, they will be violent and murder us. When instead they should have said, well, once they're free, they will have no need to murder us because they'll have their freedom, and that's why they're rebelling. Southerners developed these bizarre conspiracy theories to explain why slave revolts happened, such as, oh, it's not us, it's outside troublemakers, right? At the same time in the 1830s, abolitionism was born. 1831, there's this new piece of literature originating from New England, from Massachusetts, that says not only is slavery bad, it's evil, God wants it to be abolished, and it must be abolished immediately. Now, most Northerners were not abolitionists. Most Northerners said, look, I don't think slavery's right for the North, but it's a huge population in the South. If the slaves were freed, they probably come up here, compete with me and my family for jobs, housing, etc. I like the slaves where they are. I don't want to abolish slavery. It was a small group in the beginning, but it started to grow, and these people were very much in your face. And so slave owners in the South would always say it's abolitionists working with free blacks from the North to try to stir up trouble here, when that wasn't the case at all. It was slaves just yearning for their own freedom. Southerners started to have kind of two minds about this. Despite the fact that many Southerners started digging their fingernails into the system, others said, no, we probably need to free our slaves. Virginia actually voted in 1833 whether they should abolish slavery. They did not, but it was pretty close. It was 73 to 58 in the Virginia state legislature there. Sorry, I got the year wrong, 1832. But that shows you, wow, it wasn't a blowout. It wasn't, 120 to 10 or something. It was fairly close. The western counties and the highlands of what's today West Virginia voted very much to abolish slavery. The tidal areas close to the coast did not. And so Virginia would keep it, but many people just felt we got to get rid of it. Northerners felt we got to get rid of it. So Southerners that were vested in the system started to get very defensive. Slavery is not wicked, they said. Slavery is a wonderful system. It's an ancient system. This capitalism thing, people go into factories, women are leaving the home and going into factories. Immigrant Catholics from Ireland are pouring into the North. You have riots and all this stuff. It's too dangerous. Slavery is an old ancient system. The Egyptians used it. The Greeks used it. It built the pyramids of Egypt and the Colosseum of Rome. We know where that leads to. Capitalism is brand new, and it's a fad, basically, is what people felt. At least Southerners felt that way. And so they started to pass laws that would strengthen slavery, such as you couldn't free slaves anymore. Every Southern state in the 1830s passed laws against manumission. Can't free your slaves because we don't want any free blacks living in our state. Some of these states passed laws that said if you are free and black, you must move out of the state within 1 year. And then Northerners started to pass similar laws saying, well, don't move to our state. The state of Illinois outlawed black migration in the 1830s when all these anti-manumission laws were passed. And so I don't want you to think, well, Northerners were anti-racist. Nope, just a different kind of racist, right? We don't want slavery, but we also don't want free black people living in our state, was the attitude. New England was about the only exception to this. But it was so far north, so few slaves could get there. So, this is sort of the attitude of the South. It's a weird anomaly at a time where the North was 2/3 of the population of the US. It was the prototype of what the US, and when we think about America, we often don't think of Southern culture. That's sort of a subculture of the greater American culture. The North really was America, and the South more and more felt, wait a minute, we're the inheritors of the Revolution. We were George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Monroe. Most of the founding fathers, they argued, were Virginia planters and slave owners, Patrick Henry, for instance. And they just felt these Northern Yankees were pretenders, that they were not actually inheritors of the Revolution and that they were kidding themselves, basically. So this is the division that starts to set in America. Now, the next thing to talk about is the North and how it would start to develop. The North would undergo a huge revolution during this time period. This is when the Industrial Revolution first starts to come to America. Now, most historians divide it into two phases. They'll call it the first Industrial Revolution and the second. And there's different components of it, but basically, this is the process of moving from farms to factories, from rural areas to urban areas, from making things by hand to making things by machine. And it started to happen in the early 1800s in America. And after the Civil War, there'd be another big, revolution, but the technology would be different. So it's often divided into two different phases. So what are the phases of industrialization in America during this time period? Well, the first one is transportation. So prior to the 18 teens and 20s in America, the fastest, best way to move something was by ocean-going vessel using wind power or by horse, traveling relatively slowly. This would undergo a revolution at this time. The steam engine was invented by James Watt in the 1750s. He was a British inventor, but that steam engine really just was used for producing more coal, for conveyor belts to get coal out of coal mines. It was a pair of American inventors, um, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston, who invent the steamboat in New York in 1807, pretty early on, actually. They figured out that if you put a steam engine with pistons and attached it to a big paddle wheel, it would push it forward, and this could make ships that would travel much faster than wind-powered vessels. And the coolest part, you could go against the current of a river. Now, we were blessed with this wonderful river system, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, and all of the rivers east of the Appalachians. Most people lived by water, either by river or by the ocean. Now you were very close to all these commodities. So a country where most people were fairly isolated from markets and they couldn't get European goods, and mostly Americans at this time, they would barter and trade. You'd basically plan your season with your neighbors. You'd depend on them and you trade for the few things you had. You'd sell a few little bit of surplus grain, so you'd have a little bit of money and you would supplement it market. Now that's reversed. Now we make almost nothing on our own. We sell our labor for money and we go out and buy almost everything that's made by somebody else. And this started to trend the other way during this time period. Remember, the first factories opened in 1814 in Lowell, Massachusetts, making shirts and pants. Then after the War of 1812, several other businesses, companies that made shovels and picks and cotton gins and other farming equipment and plows, homemade furniture, right? Tables, desks, chairs, things like that. All of these businesses started to come out and they were all mechanized. Lots of inventors spent lots of hours trying to figure out how can we make this by steam so we could improve production. And production of almost everything exploded at this time. We'll get down more on this on number 3, but now you could move it all throughout the interior of the country, getting to almost everybody. So now, by the 1820s, you have this handsome young couple wearing clothes that they did not make themselves or make by hand, but they were mass produced in a factory, and you just go and you buy it and it's ready to wear. It used to be you'd go to a tailor and they'd take your measurements. They still do this if you want a really well-fitted piece of clothing. It's very expensive if you've ever done that before. I've only had a suit made for myself one time, and it was because I was in Vietnam and it was super cheap. It was like $40, something like that. In America, it's in the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to get a suit or a dress made by hand. We just buy stuff that's off the rack because it's cheaper, right? Who cares? And this is one of the changes. Now, this upset the economy quite a bit. What's going to happen to tailors? They're going to lose their jobs. Yeah, but Americans go through this. We're a very adaptable society where our education system reflects that. Both then and now, we don't do what most European countries do, where they basically find what your talent is at a very young age, 13, 14, 15, and then they track you into that vocation. Like in Germany, they basically test you in elementary and middle school, and then they say, well, your aptitude is to work with your hands, you're going to be a plumber, carpenter, and we'll just put you in that direction. In America, we just sort of give you a broad liberal arts education. We teach you how to learn, and then a lot of stuff is self-taught so that you could go retrain yourself and have multiple jobs throughout your life. And that was the 1820s, right? You trained to be a barrel maker, then that would be replaced by technology, and then you'd go and become a silversmith and retrain yourself to get another job, basically. Almost every northerner had a trade on the side because you have that long winter and fall season and you got to make money. And so you'd learn how to make something, usually by hand. Now, daughters would be sent into factories to make a little extra money as well. I'll explain why daughters and not sons in a minute. So mostly this is steamship. Yes, there are some railroads. The first steam engines for locomotives come out in the late 1830s. Then you have some in the 1840s and 50s, but really they did not get going until after the Civil War. Until the 1870s and 80s is when railroads explode in this country. Most people preferred to move things by canal, even though it was slower, because ships are bigger and you can carry more things, which decreases transportation costs. Costs of almost everything collapsed. That was the biggest price of things, especially in the West, where goods had to be hauled over by wagon. Most people made their own clothes in the 1790s in Ohio. They were wearing buckskin and deerskin like they were cavemen and cavewomen. Now they were buying the height of fashion in Ohio, right? Which was the frontier, basically. Okay, commercialization. This is the next thing. In order to fuel all of this buying of commodities, you need paper money. And so you needed a banking system. In last time around, I had mentioned that Hamilton first charters the national bank in 1791. It had a 20-year charter, so it expires in 1811. It died. For 5 years, we had no national bank, so banks just kind of did their own thing, which means they just printed their own money, basically, and regulated their own value of it. In 1816, Madison did a reversal, approved a second national bank, and we would have that until 1836. So all during the 1820s and 1830s, it was actually very easy, no matter where you were, to go into a bank, ask for credit, ask for a loan, go buy things on credit, get a mortgage, and buy things that you didn't want to make yourself. Get access to paper money, sell your goods and get paper money rather than barter and trade. And this, we're undergoing a revolution today as well. If you guys could just understand how we lived in the 80s and 90s, it was barbaric and primitive, meaning I still remember this, like ATM machines were invented in the late 70s, early 80s, but they did not really exist outside of banks. It was like, oh, you could go to the teller or you could go to this computer teller, basically, which was either in the inside or outside of banks. It still was a hassle to get to them. They didn't have them all over the place. And now they're even disappearing because nobody uses paper money anymore. I can still remember going on a Friday to the bank with my father to get cash, because if you didn't have cash on the weekend, you couldn't really do anything. You could pay by check, but that was a hassle and annoying. Credit cards existed, but a lot of places didn't take them. Now it's so much easier. We all have Apple Pay and Venmo and Zelle and all these apps that allow us wireless transfers. It's incredible now. So easy, you know, you ask your parents for money at college, they send it to you in 2 seconds, it's in your bank account. Before, mom and dad have to mail you a check. It'd take 3-4 days to get to you. You'd have to go to a bank, see a human being, deposit it, and 3-4 days after that, it would be in your bank account. If you make it easier for people to spend money, guess what? They will spend money, right? If you wait in that long line, you know, you're out with your friends at, you know, some sporting event, you wait in a long line, you get to the front and they say, oh, cash only, and you don't have cash. Chances are you're going to be like, do I really want to go to the other side of the stadium and get money out of an ATM? Forget it. But what if they have some electronic means of paying for something? You're going to buy more, demand will go up, production will increase. That's good for the economy. And so all these changes were happening at the time. Lastly, you have industrialization. So what this means is mass production of commodities by steam power. Again, the first factory, 1814 in Lowell, making shirts and pants. By the 1830s and 1840s, almost every commodity is being made by steam power, and we're making them in America, all in the North. The South has almost no factories. There's a few exceptions in places like Baltimore or Louisville or St. Louis or New Orleans, Atlanta, but small compared to the North. Every northern town has steam-powered factories, newspaper print shops, everything that you might imagine. And so that made a lot of people a lot of fortunes. And it created job opportunities for hundreds of thousands of Americans. The weird thing was, in America, we had the reverse problem everybody else did. Europe was overpopulated and underemployed. We were the opposite, meaning if you asked the average man from Ohio, would you rather walk into a factory and work 16 hours a day making things, or would you rather own a farm here and be your own man? And most men would say, I'd rather have my own farm. It's not really until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that native-born Americans, and I mean something different than Native Americans here, let me explain that. So this was the term used for what today we would refer to as WASPs, if you guys know that term. A WASP it stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And what it means is you're a white person in America and you're descended from the original English settlers that came here in the 1600s. All the white folks that came later, the Irish, the Greeks, the Russians, Jews from Eastern Europe, they came later. They're white immigrants as well, but they're not the original, English settlers. So White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, that's what it stands for. And it used to be there was a hierarchy of whiteness in America, meaning that WASPs used to think we're the best in America. And, the Dutch, you're kind of cool. You're in the circle too. You're not Anglo-Saxon, but you're white Dutch Protestants. That's cool. And then everybody else was kind of on a tier below you. weirdly enough, but that's the way it was until about the 1960s in America. Uh, fathers, mothers would be very upset if their daughter said, I'm marrying an Irish Catholic boy, and there'd be big tears. Oh my God, this is the biggest embarrassment. Nobody cares about that anymore, right? White is white in America. Basically, most white folks in America are mutts today. They don't even know what they are. Or they imagine what they are, and then they go on Ancestry and go, oh, I thought I was Irish, but really I'm, Greek or something else. They have no idea. And so a person like that was born in America and felt that he was better than most people is not going to say, oh, yeah, I'd love to go into a factory. Now, in Germany, in Belgium, in France, in England, you had few opportunities. Land prices were so high, you couldn't do that. So they had their own population to draw from. In America, we basically had two groups that were willing to go and work in factories: women and immigrants, which is why America again became a nation of immigrants. We opened up the floodgates and let Irish Catholics in because no one in America said, yeah, I'd love to work in a factory for 16 hours a day and never own anything and just make wages. That's terrible. Why 16 hours? Why not 8? Why not 40 hours a week? All those are regulations that come later in the 19 teens and 20s. None of that existed at the time. Capitalism was brand new. Industrialization was brand new. Nobody knew the rules. So factory owners just said, all right, arrive at sunrise and you can leave at sunset, right? And sometimes it was longer than that. So women were the first in the 20s and 30s to move into these factories and make wages. And they were smart and well-educated, and they organized labor unions and went on strike. So a lot of owners just said, you know what, let's just fire these women, these waspy women born in America, because they have high expectations. Let's break their union strength with hiring Irish immigrants, who most of them are illiterate, desperate, and just grateful to be in America because they're starving from the potato famine. And so that mechanism was used to break a lot of strikes. But at the same time, these people were desperate. They, axiomatically, you would have to argue their lives were better by coming to America because nobody forced them. They came of their own free will. So as bad as this capitalist system was, it did give opportunity to hundreds of thousands of immigrants and to women. And many women at the time said that this was sort of their first taste of freedom. All of the future suffragettes, that term's kind of loaded, and we'll talk about that later, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they would say that they got their first start of independence and ambition and freedom by leaving the house, being away from their family, and earning an income. They would make $2 a week working in a factory making shirts and pants. And it was brutal and it was rough. But when they came home, they would work 2 or 3 years, right? You wanted to get married, settle down, have kids. But if you were like 12, 13, up to about 22, what if you're a father, you've got, 9 kids, 7 of them are girls. You don't need that many girls on the farm. Back then they had strict gender roles, and the sons would go out in the field and the girls would stay in the home and help mom with all of the chores. Maybe you only need 2 or 3 women in the house. And so women would go off and earn wages, and then they'd come home and say, you know what, I earned this money. I worked for 2 or 3 years to make it. Father, you're not just going to go buy whiskey or some silly thing that you want. And it was like, whoa, women now were having a say in how the household was being run. And that was a huge leap forward in gender relations. Now, in the South, it doesn't quite take root yet because it was felt, again, labor was something that Black slaves did. And free white men didn't want to go work in factories, and the idea that white women, no, they had this notion that women were ladies, that they stayed at home, that they wore gloves, white gloves when they went to church. It was still this highly patriarchal society, the beginning of the Victorian era, and ladies stayed at home. Yet the North is, again, 2/3 the population. It starts to undergo this incredible change. Now, what's the impact of all of this stuff on sort of a social level? Because we could look at it now and say this is an interesting development, and thank goodness, because you know what? I don't want to live on a farm. Despite all of the stress and problems of modern life expectancy is over twice what it is now. Life expectancy was under 50 back then, and now it's 78. Still lower than it should be compared to other countries, but much higher due to our access to medicine and better diet and all this stuff. It's much better to live under our current system now than it was then, but at the time there were big tears shed because it was a very wrenching process. Lots of old traditions died out. So I'll give you a few examples. People wrote this literature at the time saying, number one, people don't seem to know their neighbors anymore. When you rely on your neighbors, then you know them. From medieval times on through the 1800s, most farmers knew their neighbors very well. Often your son would get married to the neighbor's daughter and your families would be joined together. And neighborliness wasn't just like, being kind to them. It was relying on them. You plant rye, I plant barley, and then we rely on each other in trade. Your wife's going to make the preserves, my wife's going to make the shirts and pants, and we'll trade and we'll rely on each other. My barn burnt down and you're going to come over and help me rebuild it, because people didn't have insurance back then. There was no such thing. And so you really had to make those, family connections with your neighbors. When you got married or when your son or daughter got married, they would be witnesses in court and they would sign all documents. They would testify in court on your behalf. We just don't do this anymore. So we don't care anymore, right? Like, honestly, I would be weirded out if my neighbors knocked on my door and asked for like a cup of sugar or a stick of butter. I'd go, what? Why don't you just go to Walgreens? It's open late and it's cheap and it's quick and it's easy. Why do I have to give it to you? That's bizarre. Don't knock on my door, right? I'm always puzzled when someone knocks on my door, rings the bell. I'm like, who on earth could that be, right? I don't have that relationship with my neighbors. My wife and I have bizarre characterizations for our neighbors because we don't know who half of them are, right? We're just like, oh yeah, that's male nurse over there, right? Because I just know he comes home in scrubs every day and, that's all I know about him. I don't know his name. I don't know anything about him. I know the car he drives, but he just drives into his garage, the garage door closes, and that's it. I would never dream of knocking on his door and asking for something. It's a new world we live in, and kind of sad in a way, but back then they cried big tears over it, that we didn't know our neighbors anymore. The apprentice-master relationship was totally destroyed by this, right? Meaning that a lot of people who learned a trade, like if you want to be a barrel maker or a blacksmith, you would send off your 12-year-old son to go apprentice for some master blacksmith for years, for like 10 years. That man would teach you everything he knew, and he would become like a father figure to you. You would probably marry his daughter. You would, he would be your second father, basically. And it was that intimate relationship. This doesn't even exist. There's almost no apprentice positions anymore. A little bit, right? Like when you become a teacher, you do, student teaching and you have like a master teacher to show you, but it's like one semester and they just show you the ropes, but it's not something that lasts 10 years. I did my student teaching at La Salle. I know, kind of embarrassing. I don't know where my master teachers are right now. Haven't seen them in 18 years. Don't know anything about them. It's just a totally different world today. We don't really have these programs anymore. Work is either so unskilled, right? Like factory work now, you just pull a lever and machines do it all. Or you have a highly skilled job, but it's like you go to college to do it, like a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant. Like you don't actually have a formal apprentice who works one-on-one with you. That's bizarre. That started to die off in the 1820s, right? Like tools, hammers, instead of being made by hand for months, would be rapidly manufactured. Eli Whitney also invented interchangeable parts, right? Like firearms, guns used to be made each part by hand, so they weren't interchangeable. Now they would be mass produced in a cast iron oven. And so like every piece was identical to every other piece that was produced on that line. So if one part of the rifle broke, you could just replace that one part. It was better. The quality generally would go down. Europeans felt very differently about this, the Germans especially. The Italians too. They're very snooty about this, right? I mean, look about anything, any major product, right? Think of cars, think of chocolate, think of anything like that, right? And you think of the European one, right? The Europeans make Mercedes-Benz and BMW. When you look at chocolate, they make, Lindor and, Godiva and things like that. In America, right, we've got Chevy and we've got Ford, and it's like, they're decent cars, they're not bad cars, but they're not luxury cars where, every part's handmade, right? You probably know this thing about foreign cars is that you can't just take it to a regular Jiffy Lube and they're like, oh yeah, sure, we got this part and it's universal, every car that's made on this assembly line. No. If you drive a Volvo or a Saab or, anything like that, you have to go to a specific dealership where they make the parts there. Europeans are very picky about it, but they make very high quality stuff. That's the difference, right? Or think about cheese. In Europe, they are cheese snobs, right? Like the cow or the sheep, right? If you want to get really fancy, you get sheep milk or goat milk to make your cheese. And they were just all free range and fed nothing but acorns. And they produce this high quality milk, which goes into the cheese. And you go to Trader Joe's and it's $25 a pound or some nonsense. Or you can buy the good old Kraft singles made in America, right? They're bright orange. They're like dyed this ridiculous color that glows in the dark. And there's like 100 of them for $5, right? All we care about is quantity in America, right? It fills up your belly. It keeps you going. Americans are really, this is our reputation. We're the McDonald's country where food is cheap and mass produced and not very good or elegant. And Europe is where they take pride in their ham and their cheese and their cars and all that kind of stuff. This is really historical. The reason for this is the power of guilds. Guilds come out of the Middle Ages when this kind of stuff was happening, like, at first modern mechanization. And guilds would kind of form together and, do certain things like, first of all, we got to protect from knockoffs, right? Like in Sheffield, the city of Sheffield in England, they made knives for all of Europe. They were very high quality. And so people in other towns who weren't very skilled would make knockoff versions, and they were low quality and they'd brittle and break, and they'd give a bad reputation to all the good knife smiths. And so the guild would form and say, you got to be a member of the guild and pay your dues. And we'll make a seal where every knife made has the seal on it. And the government will actually crack down on the knockoff versions and all the people that aren't in the guild. This would eventually merge into labor unions, where labor unions, which were much stronger in Europe than in America, would protect this. They'd say, anytime a new invention comes out, we're going to fight against it because it kills our jobs. This is our livelihood. Much greater proportion of the population in Europe were artisans, right? Men who basically made their living through some kind of handcrafted thing, and they wanted to keep the quality up so it protected their job and livelihood. In America, we were the opposite. We want efficiency, we want fast production. If it could be made by machine, do it. If the quality's a little bit less, who cares? We'll just make more of it, and we'll learn a new trade. And that's kind of our attitude in America, and our education system's based on it, and our production system's based on it. But many people cried big tears that the quality in America was just no good. Many people talked about how families were getting smaller, specifically in big cities. Starting in the 1820s, some native-born white men, some waspy Protestants started saying, I don't really want to farm anymore. I'm an accountant, or I'm a clerk, or I'm a lawyer or doctor. I could move to New York City and make very good wages, but not like working in a factory, and I could do very well for myself. Difference is that when you're on a farm, you want as many children as you can have so they can help out with the farm. What's another mouth to feed when you're on a farm? When you literally make food, it's no big deal. But when you live in a city, that kid's going to need an education, right? Farmers don't need an education. You're self-taught. By 12, they know everything they're going to need to know. In a city, you have to give your kids a college education. They're very expensive. You have to buy every morsel of food that you eat because you can't produce your own food. So kids are expensive. So what do families do? For the first time, at least in America, families started to utilize birth control. We don't need to get into the methods because it's not important. They're very primitive. They didn't work all that well, but it did see a pretty steep drop in the birth rate. The average was 7 children per family in 1800, and that dropped to 5. Now, that wasn't universally how it worked out. Basically, in the countryside, people still had 9, 10, 11 kids. In the cities, they would have 2, 3, 4, and then it would average out to 5. And a lot of people just said, this is interfering with God's plan. It's weird and perverse that human beings are actually trying to prevent having children. People, still this is a divisive issue. Amazingly, in 2020, most Americans are in favor of birth control, but some aren't, and they get kind of weirded out by it, that human beings want to not have children. And this is the case in every advanced society. The richer the country, the more opportunities that women have, the fewer kids that they have. It's true. And if you look around the world or just in our own history, as society progresses, people tend to have fewer kids because kids take a lot of time. They're very expensive. We're totally urbanized now. And so most families have 1 or 2 kids basically on average now, right? Don't you guys get weirded out when you hear like, I got 7 brothers or sisters, and you're like, today in 2020, geez, you should deserve your own reality show. That was a small family in the 1820s, right? Nowadays, that's a big family. I think 4 or 5 kids is a big family, right? 3 is like, wow, that's a decent amount of kids. one or two is kind of the norm now. And there's a lot of people without kids. This is a big change, and it weirded people out. And finally, there was an entire art movement sort of backlash based on the results of industrialization. In Europe, this would be known as the Romantic period. In America, it was known as Transcendentalism. And we get our first big, broad literary movement in America where actually foreigners are reading it, meaning most Americans as late as the 1820s and 30s weren't reading books made by Americans. We shared a common language with the British. They were, a bigger country than us. We don't actually surpass Britain's population until 1840. So they were bigger, they were more established, and we just read their literature, Shakespeare, things like that. We had our own authors, I'm blanking. Oh, yeah. Washington Irving, who wrote Legend of Sleepy Hollow and, sort of fake biography of Christopher Columbus, things like that. James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote Last of the Mohicans. But these people were not read outside of America, and they were barely even read here. In the 1840s and 50s, there's an explosion of American literature that's among the best authors in the world. And I'm not a literary historian. I don't really read fiction all that much. During the entire quarantine, I read one fiction book and about 20 nonfiction. I just love history. That's who I am. But when you talk to people who are very good, literary experts and historians, they will tell you this is the greatest group of writers that America ever produced. I happen to like the lost generation of the 1920s, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, but I have read a little bit of this literature. So what's the point of this movement? The Romantic period, which starts in 1815 and goes about a century to 1914, to the beginning of World War I, was sort of a backlash against the Enlightenment in all of its forms. Now, in America, what that meant was industrialization is great, and there are certainly benefits from it. Probably the biggest development was the Erie Canal. This was a canal dug from Albany, New York, 364 miles west to Buffalo. And the reason why this was amazing is that there's no river that connects the east to the west, right? You have this big mountain range there. And so engineers actually figured out a way how to dynamite apart huge mountain ranges and then hire tens of thousands of Irish laborers to come in and dig this trench that was 20 feet deep, 30 feet wide, and 364 miles long. Okay, again, ask yourself what native-born American waspy Protestant would volunteer for that job when they owned land in Ohio? None, so they hired Irish immigrants to do it who were happy to do it, much better than starving to death because there's nothing to eat. But it changed everything. Many people lamented that the Irish were changing us, right? You guys might think we're living in a period now where there's a lot of immigrant bashing. Unfortunately, we've been a nation of immigrants for a long time, and we've also been a nation of immigrant bashing. And many people cried big tears about the crime, about how the Irish were Catholic. There was a Catholic plot to take over America. We shouldn't let these people in, etc. But we did because the economy needed them, basically. Now, goods could get to the West back and forth. Prices dropped of everything. And a lot of people looked at that and said, yeah, but we destroyed a beautiful mountain range that's been there for millions of years so that we could get things more conveniently. And people started to pause and think about what the impact of this unchecked and unregulated would be going into the future. When New York City first started, it was a cow pasture. By the 1830s and 40s, pretty much everything from 59th Street on south to Battery Park had been paved over with cobblestones. There was no grass. There hardly were any trees left. And so people of the time started to say, well, what happens if we pave over everything in the island of Manhattan? There will be children who literally are born, raised, live, die within New York City who will never see a blade of grass or a tree. Is that natural? Is that a spiritual existence? It was the feeling that humans were becoming machines along with, being dependent on machines. You wake up, you go to work, you live by the clock. People used to not even have clocks in their homes because you just rose with the sunrise. Farmers didn't rely on any of that. It's a weird thing to think that, we eat by the clock, we sleep by the clock, we wake by the clock. Everything is mandated on it because you can't run a society without that today. You guys know that it used to be every city in America had its own time zone. You would set your clock every night at sunset. Every night you would set your wristwatch to 6 p.m. And New York City and Boston were actually about 18 minutes apart. They were different. Now, what changed all of this? Railroads and canals, you can't have something leave and cross through an infinite number of time zones and keep track. It was a scheduling nightmare. So they started passing laws that said everybody east of the Appalachians in the Eastern time zone. It made everything a lot easier. But a lot of people said, yeah, but now we're living by the clock and it's unnatural. So they wrote literature to express this. Now, what is probably the best piece of romantic literature? Being that Halloween's coming up soon, this is appropriate, probably Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I don't mean romantic probably the way you guys think, like romantic comedies. Romantic means of the romantic period. And so what it means is the plot and theme of Frankenstein essentially is like this. There is a mad scientist doctor, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who's obsessed with ego and glory, and he wants to, conquer death so that he could be the greatest individual ever. And he never pauses and stops and thinks, is this the right thing to do? He just does it. He raises the dead by basically robbing a cemetery, carving up, dead corpses, stitching them together and running electrical current through them, and he creates life out of death. He gets his wish. Is it a happy ending? Certainly not. The monstrous creation that Frankenstein creates goes off, is not welcomed by townsfolk. He's a hideous creation. He's an abomination, a crime against nature and God. He should not have existed, and he takes vengeance on Frankenstein and murders his bride, and it ends very sadly. Sorry, spoiler alert if you're going to read it. So the point of the book, the theme of the book is don't play God. That there was a big fear that science was conquering the unknown, and there were good developments from that, but there was a lot of bad developments, and that we should pause, stop, think about the morality and the wiseness of some of these choices we're making. Probably the best American book ever, always is at the top of these lists for America, and a book that probably typifies this more than anything else, our counterpart to it, the Transcendentalist movement, was Herman Melville's Moby Dick. What's Moby Dick? It's a book, again, about a crazed sea captain who is obsessed with his white whale, with Moby Dick. Moby Dick attacked his crew, took his leg in this struggle. And now Captain Ahab is obsessed with chasing down this white whale, whatever the cost, willing to risk his ship, the lives of his crew, his own life on revenge. It's symbolic, it's an allegory, right? Herman Melville's writing about the whaling industry of the time because whale oil is how people lit their homes. This is before electric lighting. Kerosene would not exist for another 10, 15 years. So in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, how did people light their homes? Whale oil. Whaling crews would go out and hunt whales on the ocean, bring them in, and then they'd have these big cauldrons, cut off big pieces of blubber, put it in the cauldron, heat it up, liquefy it, and then make oil out of it. And then sell it and market, and you'd buy that oil so that you could work, right? In those New England winter days, the sun sets at about 4:15 in the afternoon, and you can't do anything. But your bedtime's not till 11. You can now go out to your barn, you can light one of these lanterns, and you can work 6, 7 hours making barrels, making leather, making, silver teapots, and making more money. The problem was more and more people were buying it, and Melville was like, these beautiful, majestic creatures have been around hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and we might hunt them to extinction and destroy them. Just like we're blowing apart mountains, just like we're, knocking down all these trees. There's a cost to this. And so that's the point of it, is it's about man's obsession with conquering nature and destroying it in the pursuit of living a cozier lifestyle and making profits. That's the point of Moby Dick. Again, spoiler alert. So that's the point of all this literature. So we have these great authors, Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe. This is, Halloween as well, so it's coming up. So, that's appropriate as well. All of these writers are writing at this time emotion over reason and rationality, the fears of industrialization. They're all there kind of baked into the cake. And since we're in the World Series too, it's appropriate to mention that baseball develops at this time as a backlash to industrialization. So real quick on baseball. I love baseball. It's my favorite sport. I was raised on it. It used to be called America's pastime, and as late as 1966, it was the most popular sport in America. It beat out everything. Nothing was even close. The first Super Bowl was 1967, and that year football pretty much took over baseball. And in the 1980s, basketball would surpass it as well. If you look at viewership, football is the most popular sport in America, followed by basketball and then baseball. What is the complaint everybody says about baseball? It's too slow, right? One of the jokes I heard a comedian say once is that if baseball were any slower, it would be farming, right? Is that a lot of young people, like if baseball were invented today, no one would watch it. It's too slow, right? It doesn't move fast enough. Hockey, right? Things move really, really quick. Basketball or, football is just really violent. We like that. So baseball is an old 19th century sport. It actually developed from British sports such as cricket and rounders, and it sort of evolved in America. People changed the rules a bit. It's unique to us. If you guys don't know, very few other countries play this sport, and most other people hate it. I remember going to Europe once, and they straight up just make fun of it. They think it's the silliest game ever, especially in Britain, because their game that's very similar, rounders, they have cricket too, and they love cricket, but rounders, which looks very much like baseball, it's a little different, but evolved from it. They call it the sport of little girls. They teach 12, 13, 14-year-old girls to play it in school for PE, but like no grown person plays it. It's like a joke to them that these giant muscle-bound men in America play it and love it. They think it's hilarious and they hate it. In Britain, there's two sports. The upper classes watch cricket. The lower classes typically watch football or soccer, right? Which still has not quite taken off in America because Britain developed the sport and then colonized everyone in the 1800s and implanted it on them. And that's why every other country plays it, right? India plays cricket and soccer. Every country in the world plays soccer because they either were colonized by Britain or they were, colonized by the French, who liked this sport as well. We had already had our revolution before soccer was invented, so we still don't really play the sport that much. We play our own, right? We invented American football, which is hated abroad as well. The only sport that America has invented that any foreigner can admit that they like is basketball. I remember going to Barcelona and Paris and seeing people actually wear, jerseys of their favorite athletes. And it was kind of weird to me to see. It's like, oh, you guys watch American basketball? They said, yes, it's the only sport America's ever produced that's worth anything. And I'm like, oh, what about baseball? And they'll laugh. They think it's hysterical. Baseball evolved from cricket and rounders in the 1840s. The first game ever played in America was 1846, first organized game where they kept score and they had not a ref, an ump, excuse me, I should know that. Before that, it was very disorganized and just amateur leagues would kind of play and nobody kept score. It was just fun. Starting in 1846, the idea was industrialization is so rapid that we need people to get out and breathe fresh air. People think baseball was made in the countryside in rural areas because it's a pastoral sport played in the pasture. It's not. It was actually started in New Jersey, which is the Garden State, but very industrialized. People from New York would cross the river and go play in open pastures in New Jersey to get sunshine once a week. On Saturdays or Sundays, whatever your day off was, you would join a league and go play. Baseball's a sport where even, out of shape and middle-aged men like me can play it, right? Because the action is not that much. I'm not diving for catches or making crazy sprints to steal second, but, I could stand at second base for 30 minutes, and do very little, right? You're not physically taxed as much in baseball as you are in other sports. And so the idea was get out of this asphalt jungle in New York City and breathe fresh air, get your family out, right? Get some exercise. It's good for you. Ice skating was invented around the same time for the same purpose. Get outdoors, get recreation, camp, hike, right? You guys ever think camping is a rather weird activity? Camping does not exist until about the 1840s because camping was everyone's life. You lived on a farm your entire life. You didn't have electricity your whole life. And so it would be weird to go camp when you lived in the country all the time. Now we do it to kind of get back to nature, to get that spiritual drive to look up at, oh, there's stars in the sky. I can't believe it. Breathe the fresh air. That's the idea of it. And all these things are invented, the literature, the sports, everything to kind of infuse that spirit and say, industrialization is good and we want to preserve the benefits of it, but let's try to hold on to some of our traditions as well. That's the whole point of this. Okay. All right, I am going to go ahead and end it here. I think it's been a little bit over an hour. How are we doing here? I don't have a timer. Anyway, I'll pick up parts 2 and 3 later. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.